Most people assume that the fear of bathing in medieval England was simply ignorance, a quaint misunderstanding from a less informed age. But the truth is far more unsettling, because for many ordinary men and women living beneath low timbered ceilings and inside drafty stone walls, stepping into hot water genuinely felt like stepping toward death, not as superstition alone, but as a conclusion drawn from the physical evidence of their daily lives. And if you had stood there beside them, skin stiff with dried sweat, hair clotted with smoke residue from indoor hearth fires, and lungs already heavy from breathing air thick with animal dung, mildew, and damp straw, you might have reached the same conclusion without needing a priest or physician to persuade you otherwise. Since the world around them constantly demonstrated that sudden warmth often preceded sickness, that bodies heated too quickly sometimes collapsed, that those who soaked in hot tubs at bathhouses occasionally emerged feverish, shivering, and weak days later. And in an era without microscopes, without germ theory, and without the luxury of separating coincidence from causation, the logical pattern seemed undeniable. Because they did not see invisible pathogens, they saw sequence, and sequence was proof enough. So when medical authorities warned that hot water opened the pores and allowed deadly airs to seep inside, the claim did not sound absurd but practical, grounded in observation, reinforced by memory, and repeated by institutions that governed health just as surely as kings governed land. And this is the first hidden truth that quietly dismantles the modern myth of medieval stupidity, because their avoidance of bathing was not laziness, not indifference, and certainly not a love of filth, but a cautious adaptation to a harsh environment where survival depended on minimizing risk rather than maximizing comfort, where every choice about the body carried consequences measured not in inconvenience, but in illness, weakness, or burial. And when you consider how cold their mornings felt, how heavy wool garments rested on their shoulders, how rarely heat penetrated the stone interiors where they slept, you begin to understand that immersing oneself in hot water was not a simple pleasure, but a violent shock to a system accustomed to gradual change. Since the body that spent nights wrapped in coarse blankets beside dying embers did not easily tolerate sudden heat, and the shock alone could produce dizziness or faintness, which to observers looked indistinguishable from the onset of disease. And so the belief hardened, not as fantasy, but as accumulated testimony passed from neighbor to neighbor, parent to child, physician to patient, until caution itself became custom, and custom hardened into social instinct, and instinct governed behavior more reliably than written law. Which is why the typical morning did not begin with steam or soap, but with the slow scrape of stiff linen against skin, with hands dipping cloth into basins of cold water that numbed the fingers before they refreshed the face. Because cold did not threaten the body's boundaries the way heat did. Cold tightened, sealed, preserved, while warmth loosened, opened, exposed. And exposure in their world was dangerous. Exposure invited drafts, drafts invited chills, chills invited fevers, and fevers often ended in funerals. And you must picture how those funerals felt: the weight of damp soil, the smell of turned earth, the sound of wooden boards lowered into pits, because those sensory memories shaped decisions more powerfully than abstract reasoning ever could. And when people spoke about health, they spoke from the authority of burial experience, not from textbooks, not from laboratories, but from the physical memory of carrying someone whose skin had once been warm and was now cold. And in that context, the refusal to bathe was not neglect but vigilance, not backwardness but discipline, a quiet endurance practiced daily by bodies that learned to tolerate discomfort as a form of protection. And this endurance, repeated across thousands of households, became a system stronger than any individual preference, a system that trained people to accept grime as armor, odor as camouflage, and restraint as wisdom. And the longer you sit with this reality, the more the familiar modern assumption begins to dissolve, because what looks like irrational fear from a distance begins to resemble calculated caution up close. And once that shift happens, you no longer see a population avoiding cleanliness. You see a civilization negotiating survival, one sensation at a time, guided not by what felt pleasant, but by what seemed least likely to kill them, which is a very different kind of logic than comfort, and a very different definition of what it meant to be safe.
What made this cautious relationship with water even more convincing was the daily physical evidence reinforcing it, because the medieval body was not an abstract idea to its owner, but a constant field of sensations that demanded interpretation. And when a laborer woke before sunrise on a winter morning in London or York, the air pressing against his face was not mildly cool, but sharply cold, the kind that tightened the skin across the knuckles and made each breath feel thin and metallic as it entered the lungs. And he did not step from bed onto clean flooring, but onto layers of flattened rushes that had absorbed months of grease, ash, spilled ale, and tracked mud, so that the ground itself gave off a faint sour warmth beneath bare feet. And already the body was negotiating discomfort before the day had begun. Already it was conserving heat. Already it was resisting exposure. And into this delicate balance, any sudden immersion in hot water would have felt less like relief and more like a violent interruption, because warmth in their world was supposed to come slowly, from walking, from working, from standing near a hearth, not from plunging into a heated vessel that forced the skin to react all at once. And when someone did attempt such bathing, especially in public bathhouses where the air hung thick with steam and human breath, the after effects could be alarming, since stepping out of that heat into cooler air caused immediate shivering, and shivering was widely recognized as the first visible step toward fever, and fever was the shadow that haunted every household, because fever did not merely mean illness, it meant interruption of labor, loss of wages, strain on family stores, and sometimes burial. And so when physicians explained that hot water opened invisible gateways in the skin through which corrupted air might enter, the explanation matched what people already felt in their muscles and lungs, matched what they had watched happen to neighbors, matched the pattern that experience had taught them never to ignore. And you must understand that pattern recognition was one of the most important survival tools available to them, because without instruments or tests, the only reliable guide was memory, and memory was filled not with theories, but with sensations, with the remembered chill of drafts creeping under doors, with the remembered weight of soaked clothing clinging to shoulders after rain, with the remembered weakness that followed long exposure to dampness. And each of these memories reinforced the same lesson, that the body weakened when it was wet and strengthened when it was dry. And once that lesson settled into collective understanding, it shaped behavior as firmly as any written law, which is why the dry wash became routine, a method that seemed modest but felt safe, since wiping the face and hands with a damp cloth provided refreshment without surrendering the body's defenses, and the cloth itself mattered because coarse linen dragged slightly against the skin, creating friction that suggested cleansing even without soap, and that sensation of friction reassured the mind that effort had been made, that impurity had been removed, that protection remained intact. And this is how systems sustain themselves, not through force, but through repeated physical confirmation, through countless mornings in which nothing disastrous happened, through thousands of small survivals that quietly proved the method worked well enough to continue. And over time, the practice became more than habit, it became identity. because cleanliness was no longer defined by scent or shine, but by adherence to the accepted method, by obedience to the rules that experience seemed to justify. And anyone who violated those rules by bathing too freely risked not only illness but suspicion, since recklessness with one's own body suggested recklessness with communal safety. And in tightly bound towns, where disease could travel faster than rumor, no accusation carried more weight than the hint that someone's behavior might invite sickness into shared space. So restraint became a social virtue, caution a moral trait, and endurance a mark of reliability. And this quiet endurance, repeated day after day in cold rooms and narrow streets, reveals a truth that modern comfort often hides, that strength is not always loud or triumphant, but is frequently silent, persistent, and shaped by the pressure of conditions that do not care whether anyone approves of them, conditions that simply continue, like winter air seeping through stone, like dampness rising from the ground, like routines performed not because they are pleasant, but because they seem to keep death a little farther away. And once you recognize that logic, the image of medieval England now no longer looks like a joke from history, but like a record of adaptation, a practical response written directly onto the skin by the environment itself, an environment that rewarded caution and punished excess without explanation and without mercy. And so when you picture medieval England now, you no longer see people who simply refused to bathe, but a society quietly negotiating with danger through every sensation their bodies felt, choosing discomfort over risk, dryness over warmth, and endurance over ease, until the real realization settles in that what looks like ignorance from a distance was often survival up close, and the past, once stripped of its myths, begins to smell less like foolishness and more like resilience.